This time I look at 10 of the most desirable and therefore most expensive Japanese classic two-strokes. There will always be those who look down on the two-stroke as a humble, dirty, smelly type of engine. But for others, the sound and smell of a two-stroke has no comparison. A four-stroke simply won't get the job done. And there's no doubt that in the smaller capacities in particular, a two-stroke is probably the best thing you can buy. But the Japanese industry in the 70s and the 80s produced a whole range of two-strokes of a wide variety of capacities and styles. Here are 10 classic Japanese two-strokes, which have now become highly desirable machines, in other words expensive. The Suzuki GT750. Now whether you call it the water buffalo, the water carrier or the kettle like we do in the UK, there's no getting away from the sheer achievement of Suzuki's GT750. The engine itself is closely based on the GT500 air-cooled parallel twin, although there are some improvements made which were actually carried over onto the GT500 itself. But undoubtedly the most notable feature of the bike is its water cooling. This is a first on Japanese two-stroke and caused a sensation when the bike was first shown at the Tokyo show in 1970, although it would actually take until 1972 for the bike to appear on world markets. The engine of course is a 3-cylinder two-stroke with piston-ported induction. Total capacity is 739 cc's with a bore and stroke of 70 by 64. The engine has a 5-speed gearbox and of course, pretty standard for the Japanese by that time, employs automatic oiling. Peak power is acclaimed for the initial model 67 horsepower at 6,500 rpm, although top speed as tested fell just shy of 120 miles an hour. Although later models would claim 70 horsepower and were a touch quicker. But the bike was never really designed as a super sport, instead it was conceived as a grand tourer, so the engine is much more user friendly than the equivalent Kawasaki's. Although the bike's handling was similarly vague, not helped by a rather broad engine and poor ground clearance. Early models used drum brakes front and rear, which did a reasonable job of stopping what was quite a bulky machine, 482 pounds or 219 kilos dry weight. Later models would receive disc brakes all round, and while this did offer superior braking performance in the dry, it has to be remembered that 1970s disc brakes were not exactly wonderful when shown a wet road. However, modern brake pad materials do improve this somewhat. Later machines would have higher gearing and slightly raised power. This would make them more capable of the high-speed touring that the bike was designed for. However, tighter emission regulations and the fuel crisis of the early 70s would see the Japanese companies look away from two-strokes, and so Suzuki would introduce the GS750, a bike which was quite simply better. The Yamaha RD250 and 350 LCs. In Britain these bikes were affectionately known as the LCs, and indeed it was the 250 which gained the most notoriety, because as a learner bike in the late 70s, it was probably the machine that did more the most to get the law changed to put everybody onto 125s. So a nice one Yamaha, thanks for that, thanks a lot. The 350 arrived in 1980 and was a replacement for the earlier air-cooled RD400. The engine was a water-cooled parallel twin two-stroke with reed valve induction with a bore and stroke of 64 by 54 and compression at a fairly low 6.2 to 1. This all added up to 347 cc's and 49 horsepower for the original model. However, from 81 onwards the bike was detuned to 46 horsepower. The reasons for this were twofold. One, it made the bike a bit more reliable, and two, it also allowed it to meet the tighter emission regulations then coming in the European market. And of course it was a touch more user friendly too. The bike used a thoroughly modern single shot frame, and so at the time was undoubtedly the best handling bike that Yamaha had ever produced. And in fact the machine was even reasonably comfortable too. On the demerit side, it was rather buzzy when you revved the thing, which of course you needed to do because it didn't make an awful lot of low down torque. Now these early LCs were big sellers in Britain, Europe and of course Canada, although they were not available in the US market. However, the machine's replacement, which would be called the RZ in the US market or the 350 LC YPVS model in Europe, was. And the YPVS or RZ, if you're an American, is quite a different machine. It uses basically the same engine, but now fitted with an exhaust power valve, it can produce both lower down power and higher up power at the same time, allowing Yamaha to tune the engine to give near 60 horsepower performance, whilst not losing out anywhere at the bottom end. And this revised engine was fitted to an all-new chassis with a totally revised suspension system, so handling was even better than before. The initial models from 1983 onwards had a small bikini fairing, but were basically naked machines. And these bikes would remain on sale until 1983, when they were taken off the market. However, the bikes would return to the European market at least in 1992, where the bike was now produced in Brazil, featured a square headlamp and a full fairing. And indeed this model would be one of the last larger capacity two-stroke Yamahas to be sold in the European market, with the bike finally being deleted from the range in 1995. Kawasaki H500 Mach 3. Kawasaki's H500 is a bike with a fearsome reputation, which is in some ways deserved and some ways somewhat exaggerated, not least by Kawasaki themselves, whose marketing men very cleverly turned the shortcomings of the machine into major selling points. A bike for real men, that kind of thing. And it has to be said with hindsight that Kawasaki's claims of 124 miles an hour and a 12.4 standing quarter mile acceleration was somewhat ambitious. And to that end, in the US, Cycle World tested the bike in 1969 and had a top speed of a very impressive 119 miles an hour and a 13.2 second quarter mile. So impressive, but not actually up to Kawasaki's claims. Furthermore, production machine actually tested in England only achieved 109 miles an hour and had a standing quarter mile of a still impressive 13.5, with a Dutch test only achieving 13.48. So 13.5 seems to be the actual genuine standing quarter mile figure of the machine. Okay, so not as the maker claimed, but still impressive for a 500cc machine. But really it was the way the power was produced that gave the bike such a fearsome reputation. It was very jackhammer, not very linear at all, and when strapped to a chassis that couldn't really cope with the performance of the thing, it all made for a very hairy riding experience. And for some, the bike's reputation as a widowmaker made it all the more attractive. But of course they're not fools at Kawasaki, and they did work to make the bike a little bit more user-friendly during its lifetime. And indeed, its replacement, the KH750, although has an equal reputation as something of a widowmaker, this is a bit of a misnomer, because actually that bike is rather more user-friendly and has a much better chassis than the 500. But that being said, agile and user-friendly, it certainly ain't. The Suzuki RGV 250. Suzuki released the RGV 250 in 1988 as a replacement for the earlier 250 Gamma, and the new bike was quite different, having a full aluminium perimeter frame and replacing the Gamma's parallel twin with a 90-degree V-twin of 249cc with a boring stroke of 54 by 54.5. The engine made a claimed 62 horsepower and has a 6-speed transmission. And with an all-in wet weight of just 345 pounds or 156 kilos, the bike accelerated extremely well and had a top speed of over 130 miles an hour. And while the machine had reed valves and an intake control valve system to help level out the power delivery, there was in reality very little going on below 8,000 RPM. From 1989, the machine was upgraded to VJ22 specification. This used an all-new power valve system, which was unfortunately very prone to failure. Suzuki's response was to introduce a new VJ23 specification engine, which was in fact a completely different power unit that shared very few common parts with the earlier motors. But whatever year of manufacture, the RGV is an awesome track weapon. The Yamaha RD500. Marketed as the RD500 LC in the UK, or RZ500 in Canada and Australia, or even as the RZV500R in its native Japan, it is perhaps the ultimate sporting two-stroke. And whilst not as powerful as the Suzuki RG500, it is undoubtedly more user-friendly and a better all-round package. The engine is a 499cc V4 two-stroke and utilises Yamaha's YPVS power valve system to produce a very user-friendly 88 horsepower, relatively speaking of course. The bike was introduced in 1984 and was marketed as a replica of Yamaha's successful YZR 500 Grand Prix bike, although in truth the machines are very different. with the Grand Prix bike making use of disc valve induction rather than the reed valve of the road machine. However, like its racing cousin, the bike does feature dual crankshafts, with a balance shaft mounted between the two to smooth out the vibrations. The engine had a boring stroke of 56.4 by 50, and in fact had a number of design features in common with the RD350 parallel twin. Compared to modern bikes, the sitting position would seem fairly comfortable, but the bike weighed in at 437 pounds or 180 kilos dry, so not super light for a two-stroke with a 500cc engine in an aluminium frame. And then of course there's the fuel consumption, averaging just 27.5 to an imperial gallon. And while this isn't terrible, and nor is incidentally 148 mph top speed, by the mid-80s the 600cc 4-cylinder sport bike class was definitely becoming something of a thing. And those bikes could pretty much match the weight of the RD and the performance, and didn't struggle to get through emission regulations either. And so glamorous as the machine was, it didn't really surprise anybody when production stopped after just 2 years in 1986. Now, a friend of mine did run one of the RDs for a few years, and it was a lovely bike and sounded tremendous. But the fact was my CBR 600, which I ran at the same time, offered pretty much superior performance and was a better all-round package in terms of its usability. And on the road, I have to say, I didn't really have any great problems keeping up with the thing. But as fantastically competent as my CBR was, it doesn't have the size and the smell above all of the mighty two-strokes. The Suzuki T500. Suzuki introduced their T500 in 1968 and was an enlarged version of the Suzuki T250. The engine was an air-cooled parallel twin with piston-ported induction and had a capacity of 492cc with a boring stroke of 70 by 64mm. There was a compression ratio of 6.6 to 1 and peak power was claimed at 47 horsepower at 7,000 RPM. Enough to give the machine a measured top speed of around 105 miles an hour. As is typical of the time, the chassis is not the best on the market, or the suspension. The brakes, however, are a twin leading shoe at the front and are pretty damn good for the time. And later 1970s models would receive a front disc brake, which in common with most 70s disc brake systems offered good performance, in dry conditions at least. Later models share some components with the GT750 triple, and so the carburettor size and the porting was changed, both of which provided the machine with better fuel economy, but also greatly improved mid-range tractability. However, that was not a major consideration in '68 when the bike was first introduced, because Suzuki saw it as a potential Grand Prix racer, using a specially race-tuned version of the TR500 to take part in Grand Prix, winning the Ulster Grand Prix with Jack Finley in 1971, but also the Senior TT in 1973. But of course a road-based twin couldn't really compete head-to-head with MV's triple, so eventually Suzuki replaced the bike with a Square 4 for Grand Prix racing. On road, however, the bike would have more luck, lasting through until 1978. The Honda NSR 250. Now, Honda has always been a major four-stroke advocate, so not surprisingly there aren't an awful lot of Hondas on this list. In fact, this is the only one. Now of course I could have featured the even more rare and expensive V3, but for me the NSR 250 is Honda's best two-stroke, hands down. And the bike features all those things that are really great about Hondas: excellent build quality and some unique features. Like the Suzuki RGV, the bike is primarily aimed at the Japanese market and uses a 249cc liquid-cooled 90-degree V-twin engine. And while there is reed valve induction, the machine does not make use of an exhaust power valve, instead utilising a system which modified the length of the inlet tract to have the same effect, but without needing the maintenance required for a YPVS system. And having owned one of these machines for a couple of years, I can testify that the system works extremely well. It doesn't have quite the top end screaming power of the Suzuki at just 57 horsepower, but it is very flexible and has a linear power production which the Suzuki could only dream of. Japanese home market machines were restricted to 45 horsepower, but that really shouldn't put you off. The machine weighs in at just 150 kilos wet or 330 pounds, so is incredibly flexible and handles like no machine I've ever ridden in my life. And I even found the fuel consumption wasn't bad either. The riding position, however, is very much Grand Prix. This is a Grand Prix bike for the road. So if you ever wanted to know what a Grand Prix bike feels like in terms of handling, this is the bike for you, especially if you want a bike that's both drivable and very user friendly in terms of its motor power. The best 250 ever built? Quite possibly. The Suzuki T250. Suzuki's T250 was based on the earlier T20 and was introduced in 1969, and was known under a variety of names, including the Hustler in the US market and the Super 6 in other markets. The engine was a piston-ported, air-cooled parallel twin of 247cc with a bore and stroke of 54 by 54. Suzuki would claim a peak power output of 32 horsepower at 8,000 rpm, with its claimed top speed at 105 miles an hour, although in reality the machine actually fell a bit short of this, but was still impressively quick for a 250 of the period, although not necessarily the best handling bike of the period. Well, that being said, the chassis was a much improved version of that used by the earlier T20, being considerably more rigid. The engine used an automatic oiling system, and as the name in Europe suggested, has a 6-speed gearbox, with gear rather than chain primary drive. Brakes were drum front and rear, with an effective twin leading shoe at the front. From 1971 the machine gained 26mm carbs to help improve performance, and similarly wider tyres were fitted to help improve the machine's overall handling capabilities. But that was about it. For in 1971 the GT250 arrived, which used basically the same engine, but only had a claimed top speed of some 90 miles an hour. But then the later GT would feature the ram air system, so at least it looked funky. The Yamaha RD400. Introduced in 1976, the Yamaha RD400 was the last of Yamaha's air-cooled parallel twin range, and it's often nicknamed the coffin tank because it's somewhat unusual slab-sided petrol tank. The engine was basically an enlarged version of the earlier RD350 and was of 399cc with a bore and stroke of 64 by 62. It was an air-cooled parallel twin two-stroke with reed valve induction, a system which Yamaha, whilst not inventing, were very much pioneers of during the 1970s. And in common with most Japanese two-strokes of the period, the bike used automatic oiling and had a 6-speed gearbox. The bike had a compression ratio of 6.2 to 1 and peak power was a claimed 44 horsepower at 7,000 rpm, enough for a top speed of 106 miles an hour. So whilst not particularly rapid, the bike was nevertheless full of that two-stroke character, and was quite light at just 364 pounds or 165 kilos. And with fuel consumption of around 40 to the gallon imperial, was actually pretty good for a two-stroke. And as well as that very period slab styling, the bike bristled with modern features, including all-round disc brakes and cast wheels. Another interesting feature was that later models would feature electronic ignition, but by the end of the 70s it was getting increasingly difficult to get the engine to give the performance needed, meet the emission regulations and stay cool. So not surprisingly, a liquid cool engine was developed to replace it. But not before the bike would have some fun in the sun, with modified versions of the 350 and the 400 both seeing service and production racing during the 1970s. The Suzuki RG500. Barry Sheen, Will Hartog and all, what could be more 70s than the RG500? The epitome of the screaming 1970s Grand Prix bike, with its screaming 90 horsepower disc valve induction square 4 engine. And indeed the machine would bring Suzuki great Grand Prix success, both as a works bike and as a customer bike. But even though the race fans were crying out for a fully fledged race replica, Suzuki simply didn't build it. Well, not during the 70s anyway. However, in 1985, with the Grand Prix bike now well past its sell-by date, Suzuki finally released a race replica version, although it's likely Yamaha's development of the RD500, which was introduced the previous year, was the thing that spurred them to do so. The bike used a U engine, or basically a square 4, liquid-cooled two-stroke engine of 498cc with a bore and stroke of 56 by 50.6. There was disc valve induction and a 7:1 compression ratio, with Suzuki claiming an impressive 95 horsepower at 9,000 rpm at the crank, or 83 horsepower as actually measured at the rear wheel. Fully fueled, the bike had a wet weight of 175 kilos or 386 pounds, so was impressively light and correspondingly offered impressive acceleration too. I'm afraid here is where the good news ends, because the Suzuki chassis was simply not as accomplished as that of the RD500. And while the Yamaha's engine was surprisingly well mannered, the Suzuki's was what can only be described as batshit crazy. Because while the engine is very flexible in fact, and burbles along very nicely at anything below 7,000 RPM. Anything above that figure and it starts to go completely bonkers, and let the needle swing anywhere around 9,000 RPM and you're basically a passenger. So ham-fisted use of the throttle by somebody not experienced with the bike could land the rider in serious trouble. And here the story of the Suzuki very much mirrors that of the Yamaha RD. With the 4-stroke 600s arriving, the bike seemed somewhat outdated. Simply put, the new generation of 600s offered a better all-round package, but they weren't nearly as batshit crazy though. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us cover in a future video? Perhaps you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.